All right, we're in the book of Nahum this evening. Okay. Nahum is the seventh book in the Minor Prophets. And where it is in our English Bible is in the same place that is in the Hebrew Bible, as well as the Syriac and the Latin Vulgate. And in the Septuagint, Nahum follows Jonah. And in all forms of the Bible, Old Testament, Nahum precedes Habakkuk. Nahum has been called the prophet of Nineveh's doom. Right, the word, his name means comfort or consolation. It is a shortened form of Nehemiah. And let's see, I have him contemporary. He may have been contemporary with Jeremiah and Habakkuk and Zephaniah. And if it's Jeremiah, then it's Ezekiel and Daniel. Maybe Daniel more than Ezekiel, but anyway. His message is one of doom to Nineveh. Now, Jonah preached to Nineveh, and they repented in sackcloth and ashes. So this is later, after that. We'll get into that in just a minute about the date. While his name may mean comfort or consolation, he had no comfort or consolation upon Assyria. On the other hand, he had compassion for his people, Judah. In verse 1, we find that he is from El-Koshite. And we don't know where that is. Could be one of three places. One is on the Tigris River near Nineveh, which I doubt. Number two, it could be in the region south of Jerusalem. This would be in Simeon's inheritance. Or number three, it could be near Capernaum. Which means a village of Nahum. Yes. Okay. All right. So the date of the book. We know it has to be before 612 because that's when Nineveh was destroyed. So he's prophesying before then. So we're going to give it a date from 663 to 612, somewhere in that neighborhood. That's all BC. All right. Let's talk about the book in general for just a minute. It's 3 chapters containing 47 verses. Okay. The purpose of the book, of course, is to pronounce the doom of Nineveh. It also shows us God's vengeance and his sovereign righteousness. All right. Outline of the book. 3 points to the outline. Number 1, this is chapter 1. Judgment on Nineveh declared. Number 2, judgment on Nineveh described.
This is chapter 2 also.
Yes, it is chapter 2 also.
Judgment described.
Uh-huh. And number 3, and it's chapter 3, judgment on Nineveh defended. All right. Now, Nineveh was also writing to express the relief and gratitude.
Nineveh was writing?
Nahum, excuse me.
Okay.
Nahum was writing to express the relief and gratitude of the entire body of God's people. Over the prospect and fall of the oppressor.
The body of God's people.
Over the prospect of the fall of the oppressor. Now, Assyria had oppressed them for decades.
Had a what?
Had oppressed them
Okay.
for decades. That's why they were relief and in gratitude of this. All right. Now, there's ample documentation from secular history of the ruthlessness and the moral bankruptcy of Assyrians. Okay. There's ample secular history
Right.
for the ruthlessness and moral bankruptcy of the Assyrians. They would drag women and children off into captivity. And they didn't do it very nicely. Women that were pregnant, they'd rip them open. All right. Somebody has figured this out, that 74% of the book of Nahum is predictive. And it's all on the subject of the fall of Nineveh. There is a king by Nabopolassar, Nabopolassar, Nabopolassar.
Nabopolassar.
Yes, and he contains contemporary records of the fulfillment of Naaman's prophecy.
He kept.
Yes.
Yeah, he kept records of the fulfillment.
Yes. Right. The other predictions in this book is that Judah would recover. All right, now let's get to the book, an introduction, or kind of before they get to the first chapter, introduction to the first chapter. Fine, God takes vengeance then with regard to his people in two ways. Number one, he becomes a champion of his people. Number two, he punishes those who violate the covenant which they have with him. All right. So when we look at verse 1, we find that there is a double title.
So now we're starting the book.
Yeah. Okay.
A double title.
Uh-huh. The book, the burden of Nineveh, and the book of the vision. So there. It is a burden. The word becomes a technical term for a prophetic oracle.
Burden is?
Yes. It's used in other places in prophetic literature too. Habakkuk 1:1, Zechariah 9:1, 12:1, and Malachi 1:1. A burden is an oracle of denunciation. God makes an object lesson out of the wicked subject. In a burden, the haughty are humbled, and the oppressed are liberated. All right. He points then to Nineveh. And this city is located on the banks of the Tigris River. It would be in modern Iraq. It's one of the oldest cities in the world. Genesis 10, 11, and 12. Nimrod would be built there.
This is the place of Nimrod?
No, Nimrod is the builder.
Oh, is the builder.
But he's building Nineveh.
That was Genesis what?
Genesis 10,
Through 12.
11, and 12.
Thank you, sir.
Now, Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. Now, also we see that he calls it a book of the vision of Nahum. This is the only prophetic work in the Old Testament which describes itself as a book.
The only work?
The only prophetic work. So that means that it was a literary form before it was an oral form. So he was not like Amos and some of the others who preached it and then wrote it. He wrote it then. He was a writer and a composer. All right. Next, we see that it is the origin or the vision of Nahum, which would show the origin, which is the revelation of God. So we saw these things, and he graphically described them in his book. And of course, it talks about the doom of Nineveh. So 3 other prophets, Old Testament prophets, are identified by hometown. Okay, so that means there's going to be a total of 4. You have Nahum is identified by hometown. Amos is identified as being from Tekoa. Then Micah from Moresheth, Moresheth. And then Jeremiah from Anaroth, Anathorh.
One more time on the name of the town.
Anathorh. O-R-H.
Okay.
All right. So in this vision then, he's going to describe God in verse 2. And then verses 2 through 8 is really a psalm. Some of the scholars try to make this a acrostic psalm, but that's pressing it pretty hard. It would be acrostic in the Hebrew alphabet, with the Hebrew alphabet, but I don't think it follows that too much. But it's a backdrop. This paragraph serves as a backdrop.
2 through 8.
Yeah. Against which the oracles concerning the destruction of Nineveh.
It's backdrop to the oracles.
Yes, concerning the destruction of Nineveh.
Okay.
So in this, we also find some principles of eternal validity.
Eternal
Yes.
validity.
Yes.
Are
All
you
right.
giving us the principles?
Huh?
Are you going to give us the principles or not?
No.
Okay.
It focuses not so much on the attributes of God, but on his actions. When we look at verse 2, God is jealous, he's vengeth, and the Lord vengeth and is furious, and vengeance of his adversaries, and reserveth the wrath for his enemies. All right, so in this verses 2 through 8, we find three divisions. Number one, we're going to talk about the disposition of God. Number two, the manifestation. And number three, the power of God.
So it's a manifestation of God
Uh-huh.
and then the power.
That's right. All right. The disposition of God, this is verses 2 through the first part of 3. Okay? God is a jealous God. He cannot tolerate any rival to love. Exodus 34:14. Number two, his attribute is venger. He takes vengeance. And it says vengeance, and it says it in there twice at least. He revengeth and he revengeth and is fierce. And there's this redundancy then serves to emphasize the point. Now, also it says in this, and we're still under the second point here, that he is vengeful, is full of wrath. He's the master of fury. But understand, God cannot sin. So here is, the Bible tells us to be angry and sin not. So God does not sin. So this is then, yes. Jealousy, wrath, and vengeance are a cluster of closely related concepts in the Old Testament. Then number 3 is in verse 3, we find that God is slow to anger. He's not hasty in his exercise of wrath. God does not strike without rhyme or reason. So his wrath is well planned and placed.
So his what? His wrath is well placed?
Planned and placed.
Okay.
All right, now number 4, God is powerful. Great is thy power, verse 3.
I'm totally lost, but go ahead.
Okay.
Verse 3.
Mm-hmm. I think these are attributes of God we're talking about.
I thought you said it was an attribute.
Well,
You said it
disposition.
was actions, not attributes.
Well, actions of God. He's jealous. He's an avenger. He's patient. He's powerful.
Right, got it.
He's in a position to execute any threat, no matter how unlikely or difficult. He is also just. It talks about and will not at all acquit the wicked. Okay. He will not declare the guilty to be innocent. So there's no amount of bribery, flattery will deflect his judgment.
Can't be bothered.
Yeah. Now in verses 3b through 5, we find the manifestation of God. Okay, it talks about the whirlwind. And so that would be like a tornado for us.
This is verses
3b through 5.
Is what? Say that.
Manifestation of God.
Okay.
So the whirlwind then are tornadoes. And Nahum sees God as traveling through the tornadoes. He walks across the clouds as though they were dust beneath his feet. Okay, that's 3b.
Mm-hmm.
All right, then he rebukes the sea by making it dry. That's verse 4.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this would be then as when in the Exodus 14, when they passed through on dry ground. When they passed over into Canaan, Joshua chapter 3. And when the 2 prophets were making their way through Jordan, 2 Kings chapter 2. That'd be Elijah and Elisha. So 3 times. That might be a good test question right there. Okay. The hills, the mountains, and the rivers, and the sea are under control of God. The hills melt. In verse 5, it says the hills melt, and that is then pour forth like lava. All right, verses 6 through 8, we find the power of God. And in this, he uses two rhetorical questions. Let's see.
Who can stand before his indignation?
Yes,
And who can abide in the fierceness of his anger?
that's right. His anger. In my Bible, there is no space in between his anger.
Any type of
Let's see here. It also mentions fire, does it not? Let's see.
It says the fury is poured out like fire.
That fire is probably like lightning.
Like on Mount Sinai.
Well, when it pours out on high rocks, high massive rocks.
Well, it says and the rocks are thrown down.
Yeah. And then it talks about God's power through the protection of his people.
That'd be verse 7.
Yes. The
God's power through the protection.
the stronghold of the day of trouble. So anytime, physical or spiritual, then God knows. And then he has a place. He is the place of refuge. Those that trust in him. Takes a refuge in him. He knows them. He has intimate knowledge then. So this suggests divine approval, selection, and care. All right, and he talks about the utter end, and the darkness shall pursue his enemies. Nineveh would be destroyed, never to be reoccupied. And could have been a series of disasters and assaults upon Nineveh. And this has been found out to be true according to secular history. All right. In verses 9 through 14, we're going to find the verdict of the judge. My Bible has the destruction of Nineveh and the deliverance of Judah. I like that. Destruction of Nineveh and the deliverance of Judah. So he addresses Nineveh then. Notice in verse 9, he asks a question here, and it's a rhetorical question again. What do you imagine against the Lord? This was really what the Assyrians had done. They had imagined things. And in the Assyrian literature, they have this, what their neighbors are doing and plotting and scheming against them. And thus, they also then, this is what they do. So what they imagine, or what they imagine other people are doing is what they're doing. Now, to plot against Judah was in effect to plot against God. And then he says to make the full end, God's going to stop that kind of plotting. Okay? He will make an utter end. There in verse number 9. The Assyrians cannot successfully withstand the God of Israel. Nobody can. But Nineveh, or the Syrians, surely could not. Now he's going to use 3 similes to describe the disaster approaching Nineveh. The first one's going to be the thorns, folding together as thorns. Okay. The massive walls that Assyrian had, that Nineveh had. Now understand it was so wide that the top of them, they could put 3 chariots side by side and running around the wall.
Is that what the thorns mean?
Yes, those thorns then would not stand. That's going against the power of God. I mean, these walled cities, okay, are going to be like a pile of thorns, brushes. They're just not going to stand up to God. And then the second simile is the drunken as the drunkards. So here's this once proud city can't even defend itself. They're confused and they're incapable of mounting a credible defense. And the third simile is they're going to be dry as stubble. And they would be consumed. All right, and then in verse 11, it talks about the wicked counselor. I don't think that's a single individual, but the personification of the spirit of hostility. Now, in verses 12 and 13, he's going to address Judah. right? He says, there is one cometh out of thee, but that imagineth evil against the Lord, a wicked counselor. Verse, this would be 11, this is 12 and 13, excuse me, 12 and 13. Thus the Lord, saith the Lord, though they be quiet, and likewise many, they shall thus be, they be cut down when he shall pass through, and I will afflict thee, and I will afflict thee no more. For now will I break his yoke from off thee, and I will burst thy bonds in sunder. So, the affliction of Judah by Nineveh would cease.
Affliction of Judah by Nineveh.
Would cease. For more than 100 years, Nineveh or Assyria would have been afflicting Judah. They had to pay tribute. They had to submit to all sorts of indignities. And God said it stopped. God would free those who were in bondage to Assyria. All right, verse 14, he's addressing the ruler, Nineveh ruler. Now, in verse 14, all the Hebrew forms, the nouns are masculine. And probably referring to the king of Assyria. Right, he's giving a commandment against him, and this is a judicial order. And it's in threefold. Number one, the king's name would no longer be sown. It means his descendants would be no more. Second, out of the house of thy gods, I will cut off thy graven images. So the gods of Assyrians, their temples would be emptied. They would be ransacked. And when you study like Isaiah and Jeremiah, you find where God tells them to plead to their graven images. And essentially that's what he's saying here, but their graven images can't save them. Their graven and molten images would not be able to save them. The shrines, the houses would not save them. Then thirdly, the king would be deprived of his royal mausoleum. God would dig his grave. The king would have no time nor strength to build his own tomb. You understand that they did that back then. Here, look at the pyramids. That was mausoleums for the kings, for the pharaohs. So they placed great monuments and then not going to have that time or the strength. And then God would treat the corpse as vile. The burial would not be accompanied with pomp and pageantry. His burial would be a muddy grave. And God would bury his capital as well. So this is all going to be completely destroyed. The once proud metropolis would be thoroughly buried by God. And this was so complete that it took until 1843 before anybody found any ruins of Nineveh. All right, then in verse 15, we find this. This is a reaction then. All right. And behold, then, as he begins this verse, is to introduce an unexpected announcement. The report of Nineveh's fall would be good news for both Isaiah and Micah. Here is the ultimate destruction of God's of the enemies of God's people. And there may be some messianic prophecies and implication in this verse too. Paul uses this in Romans chapter 10 and verse 15. Romans 10 and verse 15. I think it says, who hath believed their report? And how shall they preach except they shall be sent, as is written, how beautiful are the feet of them that preach the gospel of peace and bring glad tidings, good things. All right, in the light of there was going to be, in light of the oppressor, the faithful are exhorted to do two things. One, celebrate their feast. Keep thy solemn feast. And number two, perform thy vows.
And this was what?
Verse 15.
I know, but it's thus directed
to the faithful.
Okay.
So apparently during the latter part of especially Assyrian, during this time, they could not keep their rites that they needed to do to worship God, nor could they keep their vows that they had made to God.
Because of the Assyrian captivity.
Because of the Assyrian oppression. Not necessarily their captivity, because Judah did not go into Assyrian captivity. It was only Israel went into captivity. But there was an oppression there. They did come down and oppress those people. So here Nahum is rejoicing over the restoration of the pure worship of God. It is to God's honor. All right, so here is peace and joy and religious liberty to be celebrated. The wicked one, the oppressor, shall no more pass through you. The champion, well, it's just not going, Nineveh would never be, like we said, they wouldn't pass through. They wouldn't bother Israel anymore. They would never pass through the length and the breadth of Judah. All right, let's take a little break and then we'll come back and get started and finish this book up.
3 chapters through.
3 chapters.
We start on chapter 2.
Yep.
Are we breaking till 7:30 or
We can, or we can start a little bit
is
before.
everybody back?
I don't know. Not everybody knows. "33 pages and 31 pages." So I'm going to have to condense that. We'll have to get. Because we have. All right, 6th, the 10th. No. 6th, the 13th, and the 20th. So we have next week. We have 4 more weeks. Okay. So what we'll do. Yeah, that's what I'd like to do. So let's see. 4 weeks. 28th, 6th. Okay. 13th and 20th. That's right. We have 4 more weeks. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll cover those 2 books in 3 weeks. And then the last one. That's what I'll do. So fast 10 minutes.
Mhm.
All right, let me tell you, class, what's going to take place. All right, we've got 4 more weeks. We got the 28th, the 6th, the 13th, and the 20th. All right, so you'll have a test next week. I'll send that out next week on Nahum. Then we'll cover, yeah, I know. That's what I'm getting to. All right, so we'll have then these 3 weeks to cover the next 2 books. We'll do that. Then on the 20th, we'll be at camp, but here's what I told you when I sent out the test that I wanted it done by the 27th, but that's not going to be, I want this done because I'm going to give you the 20th to take the test. So you'll have that test. I want to be done with this class, and I want you to be done with your test on the 20th. Okay, and so have that all done. You can take that test during this time. Now, remember, you got to the 6th, and you've got to have your introductions done on those. So let's not forget about that, and let's get that work done. All right. Chapter 2, then. Let's take off with chapter 2. This is talking about the vengeance, then, the vision of the vengeance. I think that's what we talked about. We're talking about the description. So how I had it in your outline.
I know, but is it description of what?
Description of the judgment.
Okay.
So he announces the verdict then upon Nineveh. And here is a description then of what's going to take place, of his judgment upon Nineveh. All right, verses 1 and 2, we find the call to battle. He's going to say, he that dasheth in pieces is come up before thy face. So the smasher has come up against you. God has come against us. Now, this is coming as the Babylonians. Babylon defeated Nineveh in 612. Okay, the first carrying away of Judah was in 606. 70 years, Babylon was a world power. Then the Medo-Persians, that's Daniel chapter 5, took over. But we're talking about the Medo-Persians. Here is then who's going to come, who's going to take care of these people. And he's telling them what's going to take place.
So you said 612 to 606, Babylon was a world power, and then in 606?
That was longer than that.
That's when they defeated. But they
in 612.
They defeated Nineveh.
Right. Okay. They carried Judah into Babylonian captivity.
In 612.
In 606.
606.
But they were world powers for that.
Carried Judah or?
Judah.
Okay, carried Judah into captivity.
Okay. And that they were in captivity for 70 years.
Right.
That's the time then that Babylon was a world power. That's Daniel chapter 5, when the Medo-Persian took over being a world power. That's then also Daniel chapter 2, the second there. There's the head of fine gold, then there's silver. So that's what he's talking about there. That's okay. Now, next, Nahum uses 4 rhetorical imperatives. Toward the city.
Toward the city?
Mm-hmm.
Or what kind of imperatives?
Rhetorical. All right. He says, keep thy fortress, keep thy munitions, let's see, for thy face, keep thy munitions, watch the way, make thy loins strong, fortify thy power and might.
Is that the 4?
Yes, keep thy fortress, watch the way. Okay. Keep the, all right.
Keep the munition. Is that like ammunition?
Keep the fortress, yes. Secure whatever. Make your loins strong. and fortify your powerful mighty. This is a rapid fire. And it shows the emergency commands.
Emergency.
Yes. All right, and then he uses the name Jacob in verse 2. And this is the Lord had turned away the excellency of Jacob as the excellency of Israel, for the emptier have emptied them out and marred their vine branches. This is talking about what Assyria had done, the humiliation that Judah had received at the hands of the Assyrians. The Assyrians have blasphemed God. They demanded that the altar of their God be erected in Jerusalem. All right, then he says the marred their vine branches. This is talking about then how Assyria had gathered the fruit of God's vineyard and poured out that fruit and destroyed the branches. They had roughshod over God's people. All right. In verses 3 through 5, we find a vision of the conflict. And I think vision is a good thing because we're going to see the scene, the shields of the mighty men is red. He's going to describe then these things.
You got a lot of cover.
Okay. Nahum envisioned the chariots and the broad street led to the walled cities. The polishment, the ornaments reflected in the sunlight. And he's mentioning these things then. The flashing would stand and remind him of flashing torches. So that's verse 4. Okay, the torches. And this is then the reflection of the sun. You know, they would polish their shields and then on their chariots and that type of thing. So, and they would flash that into the eyes of their enemies. Okay. In verse 5, there's some difficulty there. Okay. Some may think that it's the defenders of Nineveh. Some think that it's the invaders. I think this is the invaders. They stumble at the load of dirt and debris that were hauled to the wall. And that's how they would overcome. They would make these sieges and overcome, build the dirt up and come over the walls. That's what they were doing. Okay. He shall recount the worthies. They shall stumble at their walk. They shall make haste to the wall thereof, and the defense shall be prepared. Verses 6 through 10. The vision of the conquest. Now, if we remember where Nineveh was located, on the Tigris River, okay, Nahum foresaw the river gates of Nineveh opened by the enemy. the building would be dissolved. That means they'd be washed away. And of course, there is the reports of the flooding, actual history. And then in verse 7, it talks about Huzzab, 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 Zabad. Is that Zug? Huzzab, okay. This is then the queen, the national goddess, and it's a symbolic name.
Symbolic name of the goddess.
Uh-huh. And it symbolizes she who is fixed. And I mean by that, she's solid, not,
Permanent.
yeah. And then the proud city would be stripped, carried away. Okay. Should be led away captive. She should be brought up, and maid shall lead her as the voice of dove. So she's going to be just stripped away, carried away, captive. The sound that they would produce would be like doves beating upon their breast. And that's the common agony, display of agony in the East. All right. Now these waters fled away. There's the Assyrian commanders. And they would not even look back. The soldiers would not even look back on the battle scene. And as they were fleeing, we find that the enemy was within the city. In verse 9, he's taking the spoils then. Silver and the gold. Not only with the silver and gold, but they were taking the end of the store. There was none end of the story. It was just so plenteous when they came into there that they thought there was never end of the plunder that they were getting. The population then of the city huddles helplessly. The city is empty. Look at verse 10. Void and waste, stripped of all her wealth. She is desolate, devastated, and destroyed. The citizens of Nineveh are incapacitated. They melt. They quake in fear. Their knees smite together. They're sick to their stomach. And there's pain in all their loins. Their faces are pale. They cannot lift a finger to prohibit the ransacking of their homes and temples. Verses 11 through 13. So this is Nahum, then. Now he's speaking for all the people who have been oppressed by Assyria. And he employs mocking questions.
He's speaking to the people who've been oppressed.
He's speaking for
them.
He likens Nineveh then to a lion's den, where the powerful beast live unmolested. That's verse 11. Assyrian lions were unable to provide for the lioness and whelps. His caves and dens were filled with that which violently had torn from others. And that's the figurative speech that he's doing there. They were a sanctuary.
Nineveh was.
Yes. Then in verse 13, he says, behold, I am against thee, saith the Lord of hosts. And the Lord of hosts, understand when he talks about, anytime you see in your Bible, the Lord of hosts, that's talking about the host there is the God's army. The inexhaustible power of God. And then as the Assyrians' chariots then struck fear into the people, their chariots then would be burnt with fire.
Whose chariots?
The Syrians. All right, and then he says, I will cut off thy prey from the earth, and the voice of thy messengers shall be no more heard. Here is then, as the Assyrians had campaigned effortlessly, then they would also be cut off by God effortlessly. Yes. And the Assyrian ambassadors could no longer make unreasonable demands upon the vassals. They would be destroyed. All right, chapter 3. And here is then, what did we say?
Defense.
Is this the defense of the judgment?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Here he declares the wickedness of the city, describes that wickedness, and then dissects it. And it begins, chapter 3 begins with a woe to the bloody city. And here is then the ominous future.
Ominous.
Yes, ominous. Thank you. Calls it a bloody city. That is a city which was built up through war and cruel oppression. It was built upon lies. Notice that. It was built upon lies, robbery, and prey. Okay. The wealth then was due to the lies, fraud, deception in both business and government. Number 2, robbery, which was taken by violence, that lawfully brought or rightfully belonged to another.
Is that anything about robbery?
It's taken away by others, by violence, excuse me. It's taken away by violence, that which rightfully belongs to another. That's what robbery is, you know. Nations built upon the foundation of force and fraud are headed for ruin. All right, this woe also indicates that it was going to be gruesome. So this descriptive terms that Nahum's using helps the reader both to hear and to see the scene. The noise of the whip, you can just hear it. I mean, just think about that's in your mind's ear, really. You hear that, whap, you hear those things. The noise of the whip, the cracking over the back of the war horses, the noise of the rattling of the chariot wheels, the prancing of the horses, thundering on the grounds, the hooves, the neighing and the excitement and the fear. Yeah. Chariots abounding first in one direction and then in another direction, verse 2. The cavalry mounting for attack, their polished swords and spears flashing in the sunlight. The assaulting army, now this is to be the Babylonians, is glorious. And Naaman is seeing the results of the onslaught. He sees then the multitude of slain, the corpses without number, the tangled pile of bodies, the attackers and as well as the defenders. The scene is horrible, and the resulting carnage underscores the fact that there is no glory in war. Look at verses 4 through 7 now. And here is the evil described. He likens the city into a beautiful harlot. She charms nations with her wealth, her religion, her art, her commerce, and her science. She charmed the nations with her wealth, religion, art, commerce, and science.
She was just a thriving city.
Yes, it was. The thing about it is, it was just
It was built on evil.
yes, and they were evil people. But you look at, they could have been good people. Understand, God sent Jonah to preach to them. They repented.
Mm-hmm.
If they would have stayed in that condition, just think where they would have been.
That tells you don't judge people by their possessions.
Yes. All right. Not only that, but she had well-disciplined armies. Now, you think about, here comes this well-disciplined army. They're marching in step, and they're doing, moving as one. And that would entice lesser nations then to seek alliance rather than fight.
So is Germany.
Yeah.
World War II. One end.
All right. Now, notice Nineveh was the mistress of witchcraft. Let's see, where did I see that? Verse number 4. The mistress of witchcraft. She knew the art of politically mesmerizing other nations. And then they would that set up nations through her whoredom and their families through her witchcraft. When the lovers failed to obey her slightest whim, the harlot sold out her allies, turned against them, and enslaved them. King Ahaz of Judah was lured by all of this. And he paid a heavy price in terms of religious compromise and economic oppression. What are we doing in America today?
He said he paid a heavy price by what? Something like oppression, I heard that.
And religious oppression and religious compromise and economic oppression. All right. Now notice in verse 5. In chapter 2 and verse 13, he says, "Behold, I'm against thee." In chapter 3 and verse 5, he says, "Behold, I'm against thee." So here's the second time that he says, "I am against you." And she would be punished in manner appropriate to harlots. First, God threatens to uncover her skirts, uncover her skirt upon her face, strip the wayward women.
So just make her naked?
Yes.
Okay.
And she would be on public display before the nations. She would be disgraced. So this symbolizes all the outward trappings of Assyria's power. Her palaces, her gold, her silver, her art, music, her weaponry. These would all be stripped away by war and looting.
So it symbolizes her outward what? Just in general. I'm not
Outward trappings.
trappings. Okay.
And then it says there was be the stripping of the harlot. This would be after the stripping. Then he would cast abominable filth upon her. Verse 6.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So she would be made vile too. Okay. She would become a gazing stock or a spectacle. All would observe her humiliation and defilement. Her allies and enemies would flee away. And it would be in shock over the fact the greatest city on the face of the earth is laid waste.
That's in verse
7. And no one would mourn for the death of Nineveh. No one would seek to comfort Nineveh in her hour of humiliation. All right, now the evil defeated 8 through 13. Okay. The fall of such a mighty, well-fortified city as Nineveh is not incredible, Nahum argues. And he talks about the Ethiopian and the Egyptians and those type of things. All right, there it is, verse 8. Populous No, which is a city in Egypt. Some translations may have Thebes. Okay. And they knew about this because they had captured this city.
Assyria had.
Yes. And this is in the southern Egypt.
So they had captured the city and done the same thing that was being
We're
done
done.
to them.
It's going to be done to them. That's right. And this city, Thebes, is one of the ancient wonders of the.
Mhm.
Is one of the
Seven
wonders.
wonders of the world.
Yes, one of the great wonders of the ancient world. Okay, yeah, 7 wonders of the ancient world. That's it.
It was a great city.
Yeah. Because it was in a strategic location then on the Nile River. They thought that they could not be taken. And it was the capital then of Egypt. So as she fell, then also the Ethiopians would fall. Put a couple of cities there. Yes, put verse 9. And Luban, Ubim.
Put in.
Yes. They were all powerful cities that were carried away by the Assyrians. And he says, as you did to them, then that's what's going to happen to you. Notice what it says in verse 10. Her young children were dashed in pieces at the top of all the streets. They were cast lots for her honorable men, and all her great men were bound in chains. They had no respect. The Assyrians had no respect for even the most helpless.
Like children.
Yes. So the diplomats and government officials were carried away in chains and to become slaves. So really he's saying if it could happen to those two cities or those cities, then it can happen to Nineveh.
They'll never say you can't be defeated.
That's right. Nineveh, then he also says, would stagger and reel like a drunk. Where did I see that? Let's see. There it is. No,
Oh, yeah.
verse 11. That shall be as a drunken, that shall be hid. Okay. She would attempt to hide or to flee to some other stronghold, but it wouldn't help. Notice what it says too.
Which verse?
Verse 12, it says, and all thy strongholds shall be like fig trees with the first ripe figs. If they be shaken, they shall fall even at the mouth of the eater. Okay.
So it'd be that easy.
Yes. The enemy would but to shake the tree and the figs would fall into the mouth.
Just easy to conquer.
Mm-hmm. This is a delicacy. These first ripe figs are delicacy and easily shaken from the branch of the tree. And so would the fortresses which guarded the approaches and the escape routes for Nineveh. Nineveh's defenders now would be like women.
That's verse 13.
Yes. They flee that which they guarded. It's like throwing open the gates to the of the land to the enemy. And then when they did attempt to resist, the bars and the gates would be burned with fire.
Bars.
Mm-hmm. Bars of the city. That's, they put the bars on across the.
Burglar bars.
Yeah. Well, they would put
You said the bars and the what would be burnt?
gates.
Gates.
See, they would put that bar against the
Uh-huh.
across the gate, and you couldn't. It would take a lot of force to break that bar. Okay. All right. Now, in verse 14, he's going to address Nineveh. And he tells Nineveh to prepare then for a protracted siege. Verse 14, he tells them to draw water. Number 2, to strengthen the city's defenses. And number 3, make more bricks to defend and reinforce the vulnerable places, the gates and the walls. But, okay, Nineveh,
There the fire shall devour.
yeah, Nineveh would be cut down by sword before the preparations were complete. The fire of the war consumed all their defenses.
That's the first.
Yes. Now he's going to talk about the locust or the cankerworm. There's locust. Make thyself as the cankerworm and thyself as many as of the locust.
What's a cankerworm?
That's a locust. It's a stage of the locust. We had that in one of the other, I think it's, no.
Amos?
Yes, I think so. I think that's right. All right. Even, and here's 3 points that he's going to make here, okay? Number 1, the defenders of Nineveh could be multiplied like grasshoppers. But they would be destroyed. To fight against God is pure folly. Number 2, Nineveh had multiplied merchants above the stars of heaven. There's the great commercial activity of Nineveh would suddenly stop as though consumed by a locust plague.
They had multiple merchants.
Yes.
And what? Repeat that.
The great commercial activity of Nineveh would suddenly stop. And then, verse 17, they would, the Syrian officials are likened to locusts sitting on a fence on a cold day. They are immobilized because of the cold. So the Assyrian officials will flee in the heat of the battle. The locusts will disappear in parts unknown, so would the Assyrian leaders.
Is that number 3 part? I mean,
The third part, yeah, sitting on the fence is the third part. All right, now let's talk about verses 18 and 19. Here is a graphic picture of the aftermath of the destruction of Nineveh. Talks about the shepherd's slumber, O King of Israel. The shepherds then are the secondary rulers, and they slumber in death. The nobles shall dwell in the dust, and they'll also be dead. And no one would ever be able to reassemble these people. The king is left. The sole solitary survivor.
is the king?
Yep. Then we see even he has a grievous wound. Verse 19. No one could relieve the hurt or the heal the wound. Then it talks about they shall clap the hands over thee. They were glad. And then it talks about, let's see, verse 19.
I have that the world of great will soon pass into oblivion.
One king will follow another, but each was as bad or worse than his predecessor. So I think that's talking about the kings then.
Mm-hmm.
They got worse and worse and worse. Yes, wickedness passed continually. Sin, even when it's full grown, bringeth forth death. James 1:15. James 1:15. And see, sin hath conceived. Lust hath conceived, to bringeth forth sin. All right. The Assyrian king survived the fall of Nineveh for 3 years. But with the loss of the capital city, most of his army, and he had been wounded with a mortal wound. So we find in 609, Nebuchadnezzar attacked the remnants of the Assyrian army. Which was reinforced with a large army from Egypt.
They came and helped them.
Right, reinforced. So Egypt, this coalition then between Assyria and Egypt were soundly defeated. And the last claimant to the throne met his death. All right. So we'll take up with Zephaniah next week. All right. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.